Hello all, Dr. JC here once again, week 4. This week in focus, the American Revolution. Naturally, we could spend 15 semesters on the American Revolution and probably still not scratch the surface of it. Regrettably, at least in my purview, because I wouldn't mind spending several weeks on the American Revolution, we've only got about 15 minutes here. And as a result of that, I'm going to focus on some key people, places, actions, and events associated with the war. Some causation, meaning what brought on the war, and some impact. What are the outcomes from it? So let's jump right into the action here. I mentioned last week, talking about British colonial governance, that royal governors throughout the colonies, one in each colony, were faced with some challenges, largely because they were being asked to enact in some ways and enforce in others policies that the royal governors knew were going to be unpopular, not just with the colonial representative governments within each of the colonies, but amongst the people more generally. And thus, for colonial royal governors, if they thought the Proclamation of 1763 created some issues for them, 2 years later, in 1765, this Stamp Act is going to cause quite an impassioned blowback by many elements of American society. What's interesting, at least to me, about this Stamp Act is if you look at it from the British perspective, it's at best a moderate piece of British political program, right, in 1765, bent towards making the American colonists pay for not just the ballooning war debt from the French and Indian War. It started in the American colonies, after all, right? But to also pay for the ongoing defense. And it's important to note here that Londoners, folks in London back in the old country, paid 20 times the amount of taxes that the American colonists pay. And viewed in that light, it shouldn't be a problem for the American colonists to step up and help pay for their own ongoing defense and to cover some of the costs associated with a global war that they started. Yet from an American perspective, this is utterly intolerable. Since 1607, in places like colonial Virginia, Virginians had largely, through their own elected House of Burgesses, governed and taxed themselves. So for 150 years, American colonists within their own colonies generally governed and taxed themselves. So that the idea of the British government coming in here now, and for the first time in their colonial dominion, imposing a direct tax, this is a piece of political program that needs to be stopped immediately, and if necessary, violently. Faced with taxes for all elements of American society, legal documents, so your most argumentative and articulative society, lawyers aren't happy. Tax on dice and tea, that makes sense, because if we got sailors been out 2 years, they're going to come in and play a game of chuck-a-luck and drink. They're not going to be upset that I have to pay tax and that costs me an extra ale, right? What happens essentially is that varying classes of American society that might not have necessarily communicated too much now do begin to communicate. Colonies that may have not communicated with one another begin to now communicate and collaborate. And they begin to push forth policies like non-importation agreement. If you're going to tax us directly, guess what? We're not going to buy your stuff. And so a non-importation agreement is put into place across the American colonies. We'll starve British trade. An important and effective strategy for Americans, colonial leaders too. Because if you start to put the British shopkeepers in an economic bind, cause them to perhaps lay off shifts of workers, clearly those individuals are going to be economically impacted by Americans not buying British goods. And as a result, then they're going to blow up the Twitter accounts of their elected officials, their MPs or members of parliament, and scream for a change. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what brought this Stamp Act to an end in 1766. Now, whether this idea of caving into the American colonists that were perhaps behaving badly is the best of policies, in 1765 it seemed like it was maybe best not to antagonize the British Americans. Yet 5 years later, when we get to Boston, British attitudes have changed. While time really limits our ability to get into the granularity as it relates to this most of important events, it really does. I might ask that we consider how Americans remembered the event and how British officials and citizens remembered the event. It was known as the Boston Massacre for Americans and the unfortunate incident on King Street for the British. Now, clearly the difference between a massacre and an unfortunate incident are pretty polar opposite in a way. It left individuals to question what really happened. Yet remember, most people can't read, and so images matter. And I'd ask everybody to take a look at the Revere engraving of how the event went down. Is this exactly what happened as depicted here? The answer to that is no. And in fact, if we want to use some modern political parlance, this is, I don't want to say the original, but this is fake news. While clearly British regulars did fire into the Bostonian crowd and casualties were taken, some fatal, the image that's depicted here almost makes it look like it was premeditated, entirely precipitated by an aggressive British, oppressive British force against poor Bostonians who were not doing anything but peaceably demonstrating. Well, that can be further from the truth. And again, while I can't get into the granular details here, just understand the image that's being depicted here is not at all a fair representation of what took place. And so at the end of the day, we question, why is it this engraving was placed as it was then? What did the Reveres hope to achieve? Well, perhaps they wanted to play to people's passions, not worry about any fact checking right now or back fact checking. We don't have to worry about that. We just want to get people fired up right now. It's a good thing we don't have a media that does that today, right? And thus, as some modern politicians might say, never let a crisis go to waste, right? Well, the Reveres and other Bostonian quote-unquote patriots weren't about to let this one go to waste. And the message for all other American colonies and American colonists was British oppression is real and British steel is real. And they might be coming to your town next. And thus events in Boston served as a sort of clarion call for Americans who were starting to grow tired of British rule and authority, dating again all the way back to 1763 in that proclamation line. You know, maybe it's time to get out of mom and dad's house. I get for living under their roof, it's their rules, but these rules are starting to suck. Now we'll fast forward a few years to December of 1773. And remember, these events aren't happening overnight. This is a slow but steady buildup of pressure amongst the American colonists as it relates to their perception of British rule. And in December of 1773, we have this thing called the Tea Party that takes place. British ships have brought East Indian tea into harbor. This is like really good high-grade tea. They have a huge surplus of it. They're looking to offload it. Let's do it on the American colonies. We'll put a real small modest tax on it and offer it to the Americans. In fact, it'll be cheaper than some of the garbage that they're drinking right now. It'd be crazy for them not to buy it, right? Guess what? Bostonians say pound salt. You're not going to offload that tea because there's a tax on it. And we done already told you how many times we're not paying any stinking freaking tax. Standoff of sorts ensues between Governor Hutchinson at the time and Bostonians such as Sam Adams and says, look, you colonists will not defy British rule and law. This tax will be placed on the tea. The tea will be offloaded. And you will accept it, period. And in fact, I'm going to station 2 British men of war at the entrance of the harbor to make sure these ships don't leave until this tea is offloaded. Now look, whether Hutchinson could have acted differently, how might history have perhaps changed, that's all subject to speculation. What we do know is that he was not going to be defied, and once colonials like the Sam Adamses of Boston realized that the governor's not caving, I guess we got to take matters into our own hands. And from roughly, 6 to 9 p.m. as best we can tell and records tend to serve, several hundred Bostonians will roll out in small boats to 3 cargo ships such as the Eleanor, and they'll set about chucking 90,000 pounds of British tea into Boston Harbor. This is a pretty major act of defiance. I mean, in some ways, you're like, this is 2 middle fingers to British authority, right? And historians then remember this event as one of the greatest acts of gesture politics. Look, we all still remember the Boston Tea Party today. Hell, you can't go to England without somebody's still knowing about it in a pub. And no one died. Why do we remember an event that no one died in? It's because it was a true defiance of British authority, and the king recognized this. And the king said, I'm done with this frickin' rabble in Boston now. Now we're shutting these folks down. Played around with them in 1765. We monkeyed around with them in 1770. I'm done. You want to act like a petulant little child, I'm going to smack you into shape. Blows now will decide. In the following spring of 1774, Parliament passes a series of acts, sends General Thomas Gage to take control in Boston and in all of Massachusetts, and for all intents and purposes, the colonial charter from 1691 is suspended, and Governor Thomas Gage now will run the show for king, for Parliament, for country. How do you like them apples now, Bostonians? Who's your daddy? And the enduring legacy, therefore, of the Boston Tea Party is that it really did harden both positions. There wasn't going to be much of a compromise or middle ground now. Blows really were going to decide. American colonial leaders from all of the colonies agreed to meet in these so-styled Continental Congresses. Understand these are extra-legal assemblies. Could get these individuals killed. Petitions are sent to the Parliament and the Crown to try to find some middle road. The king's not backing down. More troops pour into the colonies. In 1775, blood is shed on Lexington Green. And once open warfare and rebellion looks to be the prevailing sentiment, calls in the Continental Congress for a Declaration of Independence to be drafted. A committee is formed. Thomas Jefferson asked to write the original draft. It will take him a few days to do it. His draft then goes to committee, and the committee then will line by line begin to piece through and parse Jefferson's words. Must have been an excruciating deal for Jefferson, because he really did agonize over every word. But the Franklins of the world recognized that there was not tons in common between Americans, that the old differences between customs, cultures, systems of labor existed, and that lines in Jefferson's original declaration, saying that all individuals were endowed with certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson's original version and draft, the word property, and we know what a Virginian enslaveholder meant by the word property. Benjamin Franklin himself, what? A Quaker and abolitionist would say, Mr. Jefferson, how about we save this discussion for later once we are free and independent to discuss and debate it, and replace your word of property with something less concrete, more open to interpretation. How about pursuit of happiness? Once out of committee, it goes to the rest of Congress. They deliberate and accept it, and America announces its independence. And everyone that signed that document, as Franklin would famously state, we are all going to either hang together or hang separately. And this is no small thing. You're talking about arguably the richest and most powerful of Americans risking everything for their sacred honor. If they lose, they likely will die. I'm not so sure that the entrepreneurial leaders in America today would do that same sort of thing. Perhaps some would. Call me jaded, but I somehow think they wouldn't. And therefore, the actions of the founding generation, these individuals that signed this document, are heroes to me. And over the course of the next 7 years, Americans will fight as insurrectionists, as insurgents, as guerrillas. They will fight in irregular fashion, hide behind trees, target British officers, occasionally throw down in major pitched battles, such as the important one here in Saratoga in 1777. Some guy named Benedict Arnold will be instrumental in American victory. Remember that, long before he quote-unquote turns traitor. And at this Battle of Saratoga, the Americans then gain French support. And with the French support, it becomes a global war for the British. Many British troops are pulled out of North America, out of the colonies to defend the larger empire. And if that wasn't bad enough for the British Parliament to recognize the loss of one British army, well, they'll lose a second at Yorktown to the combined French and American armies under Washington and Rochambeau. And with the loss of this second army, the British government falls, a new peace government is brought to power, and a treaty hammered out ending this American war. whereby a Treaty of Paris officially recognizes America as an independent and free nation. Yet for the French, their economy was wrecked by this war. And for Americans, yes, you fought to make yourself free, but now the larger fight starts, one to make yourself happy.